Australian pharmaceutical manufacturers operate in a highly regulated environment. The Medicines Australia Code of Conduct is the main document that provides guidance to companies when it comes to making public statements, communicating with the general public, communicating with healthcare professionals and other healthcare organisations. The latest edition of the code was launched at the end of March 2020. And that was a really tumultuous time for the industry because public discussions about the pandemic had really only just begun, lockdowns were happening, and work from home arrangements had really only just started. So I'm wondering whether people have really had the chance to consider all the subtleties and the nuance of the changes to the new code. The latest edition of the code is much more principles-based than previous editions. So it sets out a set of guiding principles that then inform the different provisions of the code as you work your way through. And this is quite different to the way the code had been laid out previously, which was almost kind of menus based with a list of what you could and couldn't do in different circumstances. One of the things that really stood out to me was the change in the way media is dealt with. A key aspect of the way medicines are promoted in Australia is that advice to consumers should come primarily from healthcare professionals. And this is one of the reasons why you don't see ads for prescription medicines in the way that you might in the US or in New Zealand. And this makes perfect sense, but it has some implications for the way we deal with media. Section 13 in the previous version of the code said that media articles should not be initiated by companies, but it did allow for consumer-facing releases in some circumstances. So this was typically during a time where a medicine had been newly registered on the TGA, or there was a PBS reimbursement for that medicine, or it had been listed on the National Immunisation Program. Other than that, typically companies were not allowed to initiate consumer-facing media releases. There's no more one bite of the cherry in the new code that those in the industry used to describe it when TGA and PBS listing time came around. In fact, companies are now allowed to communicate either reactively or proactively with media outlets, so long as that contact is non-promotional, it supports the quality use of medicines, and it's in the context of helping those media outlets more properly do their job. From a PR perspective, I think there's much more flexibility in the new code. If a company feels that it's appropriate to have conversations with journalists about the pipeline of a particular medicine or research related to that medicine, or perhaps clinical guidelines are changing in relation to the use of that medicine, and the regulatory team feels that that's appropriate and in the context which is educational and non-promotional, then that kind of contact can now be considered as in the spirit of the code. This is also great news for patients and those that advocate for patients, that is the patient groups, because in the past there's been a lot of confusion about what companies can and can't say to patient groups, because patient groups are often considered as consumers and captured under that consumer-facing provision in the code. But now pharmaceutical companies can feel much more open about having collaborative educational relationships with those groups because, again, they're doing it in a non-promotional way, and they're doing it in a way which helps those patient groups actually do their job. So now we're in a much more flexible environment. It allows manufacturers to have open relationships with journalists, to build relationships with stakeholders, to keep patient groups involved, all in the context of helping those groups do their job. It's going to be interesting to see who can make that transition from historically seeing consumer-facing PR as one big bite of the cherry, and who can move on to embrace the new provisions in the code in perhaps a slightly more flexible and innovative way. I do really get the sense that consumer-facing PR for prescription-only medicines really is just about to change in Australia.